the forgotten language of British swearing. There was a time, long before television softened our tempers and social media sharpened our tongues, when Britain's anger sounded rather different. Our ancestors swore with theatre, with poetry, and, most surprisingly, with reverence. Each oath carried the weight of belief, class, and circumstance. Tonight we wander back through the centuries, tracing 11 forgotten swear words that once echoed through markets, taverns, and palaces alike. 1. Zounds. Picture 17th century London, cobblestones slick with rain, merchants calling their prices, and from somewhere in the din, a voice cries, "Zounds." It sounds almost quaint now, but in its day, it was electric. A polite disguise for God's wounds, the very injuries of Christ upon the cross. To utter them plainly risked punishment or worse, so people clipped and twisted the holy syllables into safety. Zounds carried frustration, surprise, and defiance in equal measure, an outburst from a world where faith ruled speech as tightly as kings ruled men. Actors in the playhouses used it to fill the air with human heat without inviting censure, and the audience loved it, proof that even holiness could bend to humour. 2. Gadzooks. A few decades later, England had changed its tune. The Commonwealth's greys had given way to the guilt of restoration, and suddenly the nation wanted colour again, powdered wigs, painted lips, laughter spilling from coffee houses. Into that bright chatter burst the exclamation, "Gadzooks!" Born from God's hooks, the nails that pinned Christ to the cross, it somehow became fashionable, almost musical. A foppish gentleman might toss it into gossip about the king's latest scandal, or a merchant might mutter it when the price of tea dropped. Swearing for a moment became performance, an accessory as elegant as lace cuffs and satin shoes. Gadzooks wasn't just profanity, it was pageantry. 3. Bloody. Fast forward to the gaslit age of Queen Victoria. The empire was vast, the manners strict, and the word bloody could still bring a dinner party to a standstill. To us it's mild, a casual intensifier, but to the Victorians it was scandal wrapped in syllables. Some thought it meant "by Our Lady," others tied it to the noble bloods, but whatever its roots, society deemed it unfit for polite ears. When George Bernard Shaw slipped "not bloody likely" into a line of dialogue, audiences gasped and newspapers fumed. For working men on the docks, though, the word belonged to everyday sweat and frustration. It marked the invisible wall between classes, the refined who whispered and the rest who shouted. One word, dividing an empire of manners. 4. Swoons. Long before the Victorians, Shakespeare's audiences knew another cry, swoons, a shorthand for God's wounds, again, but fiercer, rougher, more alive with Elizabethan spirit. Soldiers on stage spat it during duels, merchants swore it over bad deals, serving girls muttered it under their breath when the ale ran thin. England was Protestant now, yet still haunted by the ghosts of Catholic devotion, so people swore by what they secretly feared and half believed. In those words, sacred and profane shared the same breath, giving theatre and everyday life a pulse that was unmistakably English. 5. Zounds. Then came the early 18th century, when Britain strutted into coffee houses buzzing with news from the colonies and Parliament alike. Here language grew elaborate, twisting and curling like the wigs of its speakers. Out of that ornamentation leapt a curious oath, Zounds, a garbled descendant of God's wounds again, so distorted it sounded almost French. Politicians used it to punctuate debates, merchants when ships came in safely, and playwrights for comic flair. It was swearing turned respectable, emotion dressed for company. The very absurdity of Zounds made it safe. Everyone knew what it meant, yet no one could accuse you of blasphemy, a perfect reflection of a nation learning to mask its passions behind polite laughter. 6. Struck by the height of the Industrial Revolution, Britain had become two countries sharing one island, the masters and the men. Down in the East End, over the roar of machinery and the scent of coal, a rougher oath took hold. Struth, short for God's truth. Street sellers cried it across crowded markets. Factory hands groaned it when another wage cut came through. It was the language of soot and sweat, of lives lived on the edge of survival. Dickens heard it in the alleys he walked. Music hall comedians turned it into laughter. In every syllable lay rebellion, humour, and a weary sort of pride. For the working class, Struth wasn't sin, it was honesty, shouted through the smoke. From royal courts to factory floors, each oath mirrored its age, revealing what Britain feared, desired, or refused to say aloud. These were the swear words of our grandparents' grandparents, born of reverence, reshaped by need, and eventually forgotten. 7. Odds bodkins. Step back to the court of Charles I, where velvet sleeves brushed marble corridors, and loyalty could cost a man his head. Among the cavaliers, handsome, reckless, a touch too proud, one oath rang clear: odds bodkins. A corruption of God's body, it balanced between devotion and defiance. Royalists used it with flair, punctuating duels and drunken laughter. Puritans despised it, hearing in those syllables the decadence of courtly sin. To cry odds bodkins was to declare allegiance, not only to a king, but to a world of poetry, wine, and swordplay. And when Cromwell's men seized power, the word itself became a relic, whispered like contraband among those who still toasted the fallen crown. Even swearing, it seems, can be treason. 8. Egad. By the following century, Britain had traded its ruffles for reason. The Enlightenment had arrived, and gentlemen now swore as delicately as they sipped tea. Egad, they'd exclaim, born from by God, but softened into drawing-room decency. In the cafes of London, men in powdered wigs debated politics, astronomy, and the American colonies, punctuating their cleverness with that tidy syllable. Egad, civilized surprise, the perfect word for a mind that valued decorum above passion. It was swearing in miniature, respectable, rehearsed, almost polite. Even language, like fashion, obeyed etiquette. 9. Cracky come now to the later Victorians, where propriety ruled breakfast to bedtime. Yet behind the lace curtains and piano lessons, emotion still needed an outlet. Enter cracky. Perhaps from by Christ or by cricket, no one quite agreed. Shopkeepers said it when the till jammed, clerks muttered it over ink-blotted ledgers, schoolboys whispered it before a scolding. It was rebellion wrapped in respectability, enough spirit to feel alive, not enough to offend the vicar. The empire may have spanned the globe, but even its expletives were now bound by manners. In every cracky, you can hear a nation trying desperately to behave. 10. Mary. Let's drift back further to the age of Shakespeare. When an actor cried, "Marry," from the stage, he wasn't speaking of weddings, he was swearing by the Virgin Mary. The oath belonged to a generation caught between old faith and new rule. Henry's break with Rome had torn the country's soul in two, yet the words lingered like incense in the air. "Marry," said nobles and servants alike, from manor kitchens to royal courts. It softened curses with devotion, reminding listeners that belief still beat beneath the noise of politics. Over time, the word faded, leaving behind nothing but a faint echo of prayer disguised as speech. 11. Gad. And at last, we reach the final whisper in this lineage of language. Gad. Short, simple, and safe. By the late 19th century, it had become the ghost of all that came before. No longer blasphemy, barely even emotion, just a polite puff of surprise in a parlour scented with coal smoke and lavender polish. A governess might murmur it when startled by a mouse, a banker might sigh it at a dropped coin. The great empire had conquered continents, yet in doing so had domesticated its own tongue, where once our ancestors shouted Zounds and odds bodkins, with righteous fire, the Victorians managed only a prim little gad, a single syllable marking the triumph of restraint over passion. So there they are, 11 echoes of Britain's forgotten tempers. Each word a fossil pressed between pages of history, each a clue to how our ancestors thought, felt, and dared to speak. From tavern to throne, our language mirrored our fears, of God, of class, of consequence. And as Britain changed, so did its mouth. Profanity gave way to politeness, then to irony, and finally to silence. Outro, the reflection. Perhaps that's why we find these old words so charming today. They remind us that once, even our anger had manners. So next time you stub your toe or spill your tea, forget the modern mutterings. Try a Zounds or an egad. Instead, see how wonderfully British it feels. If you've enjoyed this trip through Britain's lost language, do subscribe to Inside Britain for more journeys into the heart of our history. And tell us, in the comments below, which of these forgotten swear words would you bring back? We might just make it the next great British comeback.